Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first of six webinars in relation to the first of five webinars in relation to the five conversations framework and helping you prepare for this. Look, just before we go any further, I just want to make sure that I'm being well heard here because often I could be talking to myself for half an hour and find out later on I'm not being heard. So if you're not familiar with this technology, just go over to the question box there and just type in clear. That would be great because then I know that I'm not talking to myself and we can continue. So just type, yeah, thank you, Linda. Appreciate that. Thank you. Good. Okay. Thanks, Lee. Great. Okay. Thank you. Sounds like I'm coming across loud and clear, which is great. Now, the other thing about this is that these are only short and sharp. They're only going for 30 minutes. So the point is that this is to give you a bit of a background about each of the five conversations, of course, starting with climate review. So what I suggest you do is if you've got a question at all, anything at all, or a comment or an observation, type it in over there on the right-hand side under question. And that way I'll respond to it as soon as I see it rather than wait for the end because I don't think we're going to have much time at the end to be responding to questions. So just type your question in there and that'd be great. All right. So, and the other thing, of course, is I've got quite a few people online, which is fantastic. I don't know whether you are actually, of course, everyone's on the receiving end of the conversation in some way, shape or form. But I also acknowledge that some of you online may well be in the business of actually, facilitating the conversation. So I've got advice for both on this so that, I'm just assuming that we've got a mixture in this particular broadcast. Let's move on. I'm just going to move things out of the way so that I can continue. I'm just going to cut that out for a moment. Okay. What I wanted to do is just give you a quick overview as to what we're going to be covering in this short, sharp session. One of the things that we're covering is I just want to go back over and explain how the conversations works, what the format is, and you can understand what we're up to. Obviously, I want to spend a bit of time talking about the climate review conversation here, and the reason for that, of course, is that this is the first conversation of the five. And you might say, if one of your questions might be, well, when do we start? Well, I want you to start straight away. I want you to start as of today if you haven't already done so. And then you'll have 4 weeks to complete this conversation. That is, to have the conversation with your boss, and also if you are a team leader, or a manager, the job is for you to have that with your boss as well. Okay, so it's both ways. And then of course we go on to the second conversation. I'm going to finish off talking about some tips and hints on how to improve your conversation, particularly the first one, because this is new, and some of you might be thinking, well, I don't know how this is all going to work. You might be cautiously optimistic about it, but you really don't quite know how it might work. So hopefully I can allay any concerns that people have. Now I'm recording this and I'm also going to send the slides through. So this recording and the slides will be available to you to review. Or if anyone in the organisation says to you, oh, sorry, I missed out, I registered for the webinar, or even I forgot to register for the webinar, I've missed out, you just say to them, go to the ShareSource site and all of the information will be there. It'll take me a little while to obviously process this at the end of it, but it'll be up by the end of today. And that'll be great. All right, so let's get stuck into it. Now, let's understand what I'm trying to do here in relation to the climate review conversation. 2 things that we're trying to achieve in the climate review conversation. And I guess the first thing we're trying to achieve or gauge is job satisfaction, morale, sorry, that should be morale, and communication. Now, you'd probably be aware that organisations spend hundreds of thousands of dollars doing these sorts of surveys online, and often they get shelved somewhere and nobody really pays too much attention to them. So the whole idea of this is to actually have a conversation about these things so that basically the team leader or the manager can hear firsthand some of these issues, and if there are issues or positives, and perhaps if necessary deal with them there and then, and which is really the second objective of the is to consider some ways and means of improving perhaps job satisfaction and morale. So it's really, I think, an easy place to start. It's not a very threatening conversation, and I think you'll find it quite enjoyable and probably more insightful than you probably think at this stage. So that's what we're trying to do in the first conversation. I mean, each conversation, of course, has its own objective as such. So we'll come back to the questions that we're going to ask in a moment. Let's just move on to the 5 conversations framework and just talk a little bit about the framework as such, and consider the framework and how it operates. And at any time, of course, just type in your questions on the over there on the right hand side. I obviously can't just open up everyone to say whatever they want. We might end up having a lot of background noise and all the rest of it. So this is as interactive as we get. Now, what you can see on your screen there, and these things always have a little delay when they come up, but what you can see on your screen there is the framework. So if you attended the briefing, my briefing, you would have seen this. If you've been talking to Tony, you would have seen this as well. And really, I just want to make sure that people are clear about where we're going with this. So basically, this will be running over 5 months, and what the expectation is that you will be having one conversation a month on the 5 topics that are in the second column on the left-hand side over the course of 5 months. So you'll be having your first one, of course, starting today on the climate review, and that'll take us through. And then next month we're on to strengths and talents. And of course, you are most welcome, of course, to join in this webinar on that conversation and to continue to build up your skills that way. So see this as a support mechanism to assist you. And not just to conduct the conversations, but also, of course, to be on the receiving end of the conversation. So they work in both ways. So you can see on the right-hand column, we've got climate review, we've got strengths and talents conversation, we've got opportunities for growth conversation, and we've got learning and development conversation, and innovation and continuous improvement conversation. So there's a good basis for all of them, and if you go into the resource centre, you'll find that there were some slides that I left in relation to the briefing that I gave, which will give you a little bit of a rationale as to why the 5 conversations are the way they are. So why are we doing this? Because you may still be scratching your head and think, well, why are we doing this? Is this a de facto performance review, for example? The answer to that is no. This is about building greater levels of trust and engagement in your workplace through the vehicle of interpersonal communication. So what we're attempting to do is to reduce any distrust, increase engagement, and we do this by having these 5 conversations, which I might say are not necessarily performance conversations. I would call them developmental conversations. So they're about developing you, and they're about you engaging with the person that basically leads you. So, you know, any idea that this is a performance review is erroneous. It's not. It's a series of developmental conversations where there will be some really useful information come out of it that will assist you in your own development and perhaps the development of the people that you may lead. All right, so let's be clear about, I won't laboriously go through each. I've done that. I did that in the thing, but I want to just have a little study of that slide later to understand exactly how this all works. Right, so I think the key thing now is for us to understand, looking at in relation to the questions that I'm wanting you to answer as such. So let's have a look at these, and I'm going to run through them. It's a bit of a busy slide, I understand that, but never mind. One page so that they're convenient and handy for you. But I'll run through each one with you carefully. I'll explain what they're getting at, and even how you might answer them. How you ask them, of course, is pretty straightforward. But the first question is, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 is high and 1 is low, how would you rate your current job satisfaction? You might like to go through, well, you need to go through these anyway and prepare for your conversation, but what the rating does is give us a benchmark. So someone might say 4 or 2 or 8 or 6 or whatever it might be. The question then, we move straight into number 2, and the question around number 2 is, why did you give it that rating? So this is an explanation to the person that you're in the conversation with about why it's a 4, why it's a 6, why it's a 7, why it's an 8. And so giving it a number sort of gets you focused on where it is. And we accept that these things ebb and flow. Obviously, last week you might have had a really bad interaction with a stakeholder and your job satisfaction might have been rock bottom. You might have finished a project you've been working on this week, and you're quite happy and positive about that. Your job satisfaction's gone up. So obviously this ebbs and flows depending on what you and I do each day, and mine included. But nevertheless, it's a snapshot in time, and it gives the person having the conversation with you an opportunity to think about why it is where it is. So, and by all means, discuss that. You may, for example, if you're the team leader or the manager, ask the question, is there anything we can do to increase that rating? And, you might say, oh, well, pay me more. But beyond that, is there anything else that can be done? Because sometimes there are simple things that can be done that can make life a lot easier. And I understand that you're dealing with a lot of constraints, a lot of stakeholders, priorities shift and change. There's all sorts of frustrations that you face in the work that you do, and I get that. And, the question really is there anything that you can do about it? And if there is, then you can fix it. And if there isn't, of course, you can just try and live with it, because it is what it is. So the third conversation really is around, as you can see, morale. I've spelt that correctly this time. I'll fix up that slide. So on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being high, 1 being low, how would you rate morale in the section or the team that you're working in? So this is an observation generally about how people are feeling in the close proximity of where you work. Now, why is that important? Well, I think, the team leader or whoever it is that you're having this conversation with probably would like to gauge that. They may well have their own opinion about that, I'm sure they do, but they may be interested in your opinion, and you may have some interesting information about that. And then, of course, question 4, again, is around why did you give it this rating? So again, feel free to discuss perhaps ways and means that morale could be improved. Perhaps there are things that just can't be improved. At least you accept that. But of course, like job satisfaction, we all know that morale ebbs and flows depending on the workload, depending on what the project is that you're working on where you're at the time. But it's just good to get a handle on that at certain times and see where people are at. And if you're conducting these conversations, don't be surprised if you get different ratings from different people, because obviously people are looking at it from their own perspective. But I guess questions 3 and 4 are taking the focus pretty much off the individual and asking them to start to look around at what they're seeing in their team. And that can be quite useful and insightful for you to do that, and also for the person on the receiving end to receive that. Question 5 now is around, so we're now moving away from morale, and we're now moving away from the concept of job satisfaction. So you'll notice that there are 2 sets of questions here on communication, and the reason for that is that we've taken an internal and an external view of this. So the first question, which is number 5 on your list there, is on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being high, 1 being low, how would you rate your communication? How would you rate communication within your team or section? Now, this is not a commentary about the individual and how they're communicating with everybody else. This is a general observation about the way we are working and communicating together. So this is giving input to the team leader about what they're observing, and perhaps even, and then of course once you've given it a rating, and again, like everything else, and that's why we call it climate, because climate changes. So climate in this communication area can change. It could be great when you have this conversation, and it could be disastrous in 2 weeks' time. But generally speaking, how do you rate it? And of course, as you can see in question 6, why do you give it that rating? So what this does is give people an opportunity to give observations about what they're noticing without necessarily talking about individuals. That's not really what this is about. It's really talking about what they notice in the team. Now, this is within the team. So this is how team members communicate with each other, right? So it's important we get that right. We're not talking about stakeholders or even management. We're not talking about any of that. We're really talking about how individuals communicate with each other. So the next set of questions, of course, are around communication outside your section. So question 7, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate communication outside your section or team? So what you're doing here is talking about how others within the organisation and beyond, if necessary, are actually communicating with your team. This would include management, this would include stakeholders, and then, of course, once you've given it a rating, the question then is, why did you give it this rating? So I think you'd probably have some interesting conversations around that one, because I know priorities change and frustrations occur and people are juggling projects. So talk about that. And again, the leader of these conversations might like to turn that around and say, well, what could we do about it? Or what might we do about it? And the last question, which is question 9, is there anything else that you'd like to comment regarding job satisfaction, morale, or communication? So it's just giving the other person a chance to say anything that they haven't already said. So believe it or not, that's designed to be no more than 20 minutes. Some of your conversations will go longer than 20 minutes, but maybe they need to go on more than 20 minutes. Maybe there are things that need to be discussed. But I think you could comfortably have a good exchange there, around 15 to 20 minutes on that set of questions. In fact, all of the conversations are not supposed to be a burden to you to fill up your busy schedules, and I know you're all flat strapped. It's actually about value adding and taking that little space and that time out to be talking about what we would call, it's often a cliche, but what we'd call is working on the business rather than in the business. So it's just taking a little bit of time to consider how we do things. So you can see it's a relatively easy process. If you're, someone that's going to be actually conducting this conversation, don't worry about memorising these. Maybe by all means you can have them on a piece of paper or bring your laptop with you or whatever, or have them on your phone, and just refer to them. But really, they're probably not difficult. You can see that you've got a cluster of job satisfaction, you've got a cluster of morale questions, and you've got a cluster of communication questions. So they're not difficult at all. Each question's asking people to rate and then asking why. It's pretty much a simple process. So not one that you have to sort of memorise. Guys, have you got any questions about any of that? Because I'm more than happy to take those at this stage, and we're getting towards the end of the time together. I do want to leave you with some tips and hints that you might find helpful. So just type them in there if you've got them, because I'm more than happy. And I won't say where it was. I'll read off the statement and then answer it. So anyway, I'll leave you to think about that. This last slide, and the last slide here, I just got some tips and hints for you to have a better conversation. And, you know, some of these things might be common sense, but you'll find that if you adhere to them, you will have a better dialogue, doubt, conversation you happen to be at. So let me run through. First of all, let's talk about mention coaching. It's probably not, I could have said participant and leader or whatever, but I hope you get the idea there. I'm not suggesting this is a coaching program, but some words. But this is basically you, which is all of you in this webinar, you on the receiving end of the conversation, okay? So here's a couple of things that I think you might find very helpful. We want you to prepare for the conversation. We want you to actually look at the questions, and we want you to actually respond to them in your head. I mean, you could write them down if you want to, but you don't have to. But I want you to have some kind of answer for each of those 9 questions before you come to the conversation. Why? Well, it's not great to be sitting there saying, well, I haven't really thought about that, or I need to give that some consideration before I can give you a response. Just do a little bit of homework and go through those 9. You're kind of doing it now by looking at them, and have a bit of an idea what you're going to say, and go ahead and you'll find you'll feel quite comfortable in the conversation because you know what you're going to be asked. And it's just a matter of having a conversation with the other person about how you might respond to those 9 questions. That's one thing you can do, and I strongly advise you do that. The other thing you can do is take the initiative and book your conversation with your team leader or manager. So instead of waiting for them to do this, how about you just take the initiative and book it? Just send them an email or walk across and say, look, when's a good time for us to sit down and have our climate review conversation? That way you're being proactive. That way you're getting it into your schedule that'll suit you. That way you're taking the pressure off your team leader or manager, and you're making sure it happens, because I don't want you to leave this until week 4, and when I'm doing the next webinar on the strengths and talents conversation. I really want you to have these conversations as soon as possible. And, he's going to walk around and listen, of course. Just ask questions, how's it all going, and so forth, which of course is should be doing in the circumstance. I'm not going to do the same thing, but I would be doing it if I was. I'll certainly be asking you at the next round of coaching, if you're in the coaching or at least in the webinars, how you found the conversations. Number 3, and on the coachee, be constructive and open-minded. What do I mean by that? Well, it's not a whinge session. This is not your opportunity to vent, and you might feel like venting and find another opportunity to do that. We don't want 20 minutes of venting. It's not constructive. It may well be real in your own mind, but it certainly is not going to help. So try to be constructive. Certainly you can talk about negative things, of course, and we've got you to rate things, and if you're giving it a low rating, be open. Don't pull any punches. Explain why you've rated it that. But the whole thing is, it's not about just having a whinge for 20 minutes. Be open-minded, because you might find that the person you're having the conversation with has a different perspective on it. And that's the whole point, isn't it? It's just to be open-minded and just sit back and listen to what they have to say about whatever it is, because you might learn something. So don't be too defensive. You can agree to disagree. As I said in point number 4, if you don't agree, then agree to disagree. And remember, this is not a transactional performance review. You're not sitting there mindlessly just parroting off answers just for the sake of ticking a box to say you've done it. You are engaging in a conversation with another person who happens to be on equal terms for this conversation. That's essentially all it is. So keep that in mind. And for those of you who are in the driver's seat of administering these conversations, here's a couple of things to think about. So you consider the questions from your own perspective. Why? Because it's good for you to think, how do you see morale inside your team? How do you see communication with stakeholders? It's good for you to think about that, because then of course you can explain, or you can offer your opinion while you're having this conversation with the person. Book a time and a place that's mutually convenient. So, be mindful that everyone's busy and it's not just about your schedule. Make sure that the other person, is in a time that's useful. Okay. The next point is, it's coffee as well. So my suggestion is to try to have this outside the office. I think you'll get a better response that way. I think people will be a bit more relaxed, and it's a good break from work anyway. So refer to the questions, but don't read them off. This is not about reading off 9 questions. This is about asking questions in a natural way, and you can certainly refer to them, but don't read them, please. Be patient, allow the other person to elaborate and respond. Don't interrupt them. Just give them a chance to elaborate on their response. And I guess be what I would call respectfully curious. In other words, be quite open to asking why, what, when, who, where, how, and which. In other words, open-ended questions which encourage the other person to talk. So this is not a binary thing where they say 6, really haven't got a comment, 4, no comment. That's not really what it's about, and you're just wasting your time if you went through an exercise like that. So why did you say that? When did it take place? How do you mean? If you're conducting these conversations, your job is to try to get the other person to open up and talk. It's not about you ticking off 9 questions again, and so forth. I think that's pretty much it. We're at the end of the bottom of the hour. We're only allowing 30 minutes for these. Any questions? Any last questions before we? I've either done a really good job or a really poor job if we don't have questions, but that's fine. Maybe it's just you're just getting used to this medium and who I am and all the rest of it. As I said before, I'll post these up and you'll get the recording, which is 30 minutes, of course, or a little bit more, and you'll get the slides. It'll help you as well prepare. So I'm really excited about it. I'm really wishing you all the very best for this first conversation, and just enjoy and just go with the flow. I think you'll find it'll work really, really well. Certainly that's been my experience in other organisations. So I wish you all the very best, and thank you very much.